everybody, and welcome to Marketer Live, hosted by MarketerHire and sponsored by the amazing Webby Awards. We are so excited to have a very special guest here with us today, Liana, which, oh my gosh, in our talk before this, I didn't even ask if that was the right way to pronounce it.
Yes.
So I feel
No, spot on.
Okay, amazing, perfect. So Liana is the CMO over at Skillshare. Prior to that, she was the COO at blockchain.com, where you built a massive team. From what I've read, you were kind of the first marketing hire and then just grew from there, which I think for a lot of people is one, a dream career and role, but also makes you truly like the expert to talk to on how do you work, you know, like how do you build the plane and fly the plane at the exact same time? So gonna dive into a little bit of that today, but thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited. Love your sunroom.
Thank you for having me. So excited to be here. And thank you. It's not so sunny in the sunroom today. It's pouring out here.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's going to start raining and storming here in a little bit in Austin, Texas as well. Okay, cool. So, I mean, just to dive into it, as you know, as folks really kind of start to join, I mean, you know, you've been at these organizations that have seen a ton of fast growth. Have you noticed really any patterns in what, you know, successful, fast growing companies look for in some of their first marketing hires?
Yeah, you know, I think it's such a good question. I think it's really company specific. What I would say is I think every company needs to invest in brand, which I think for not a long time, but I think in the last 10 years has sort of not gotten the love it deserves. I think we went really down the performance marketing tunnel, and we're starting to see the pendulum swing back. But I think the way that I define brand is it's not marketing. It's actually core to who you are. Like, what is your company's DNA? What do you stand for? Who do you serve? What problems are you solving? And from that, so many other company decisions will be made. And so I think it's really important to invest in brand. I don't know that that needs to be your first hire. I think you can do that with the support of really senior and good consulting help or agency support. And then I think in terms of, you know, what the first hires look like, you know, it depends on your needs. So you have to identify what it is you need to do to grow. So, you know, once you sort of build the guideposts of here's what our brand stands for, here's what we want to do, then I think you really need to get into the explicit, you know, sort of business needs. What do we need to do to be here in a year? And what do we need to do to be where we want to be in 10 years? And so for some companies, I think that's really a generalist, Jack or Jill of all trades who can come in and, you know, tackle events marketing and some social media and some brand building. And in other companies, it's like a very clear growth path. So you want a really strong analytical performance marketer. And then there are some companies where you can actually get away with a bunch of freelance support, you know, and, you know, it depends also on who's in your senior leadership. Like there are some CEOs who have marketing backgrounds. They can do a lot from a marketing perspective without needing to make a ton of hires early on. So I know that's not like a clear line of here's what I think the formula looks like, but I really think it does come down to each company's needs.
You mentioned a couple of things there that I kind of want to reiterate for people. So one, which is have a clear vision on who you are and probably even some kind of documentation or something that can explain that properly to others as you're hiring people on, as you're getting that consultant help, freelance help, and that can be done by the founders themselves. The second part, even before you begin putting tactics in place, is figure out what do you want the company to look like in a year? What do you want the company to look like in 5 years, in 10 years? And then you could probably start working with marketers if maybe your CEO or founder isn't that marketing minded person, to begin to figure out, you know, what are the exact tactics that can get us there, and then really begin to execute. Does that sound about right?
I think so. I think that's exactly right.
Awesome. Perfect. So for companies who are, again, in this rapid stage of growth, as they're looking to bring kind of more help on, like what are those kind of clear-cut signs or red flags that you need additional help on board with your team, whether that's full-time hire, whether that's agency, whether that's freelance? I mean, even outside of that, like, are there kind of internal signs looking at your own team that you're like, okay, we're growing really fast, or we need some kind of additional help?
Yeah, I think if you're starting to make trade-offs that are impacting the business negatively, you know, I don't think trade-offs by definition are bad, right? I think actually it's really important to have focus, to not be doing too many things at once, you know, to make really purposeful decisions around like, we're going to invest here, which means we're not going to invest here. So trade-offs, I think, are a really important part of building any successful business or team. But I think when you start to feel like you're consistently having to make trade-offs that are negatively impacting your business, and when you can quantify that those trade-offs are driving less revenue or less growth, I think that's when you really can justify bringing somebody in, because from day one, there is a clear role for them. There's a clear way for them to add value, not just to the team, but to the bottom line. And so it's a really justified hire. So that's one thing that I look for. And then I think as you get bigger, I look at burnout. I think, when you build, particularly early on in smaller startups, you often tend to attract people who are really passionate about the mission. And you do often tend to attract generalists who will do a bit of everything. And what can often happen is they then end up doing too much. And they care so deeply about the business and they've helped build it from the ground up. So they're willing to do, not just too much in terms of the amount of things they're focused on, which I think leads to a bunch of productivity loss, but also just like the number of hours working. So I think when you have a team that is working 18-hour days, 15-hour days, it's just, that's not sustainable and you're not getting the best work product. And so I really look to that as well. When you look at your team and everybody's feeling burnout, it's time to think about how do I either restructure or bring in additional resourcing.
Yeah. How do you think through kind of more specialized roles versus more general roles? Is it a company stage thing? Is it an individual thing? Like what are kind of the benefits and trade-offs there?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of generalist early on. I think at that point, there's so much that needs to be done that you want someone who's just a really high performer and is just going to get stuff done and figure things out. I do think as you get more mature, I think you will necessarily become more reliant on specialization. So, you'll start with a small team that focuses on some brand, some growth, leveraging agency or freelancers. I think as your budget grows, as your impact grows, you'll start to have a performance team. You'll have a brand marketing team. You'll have a creative team. And then as you get even bigger, those teams will become more specialized. So, today at Skillshare, we had a growth team for a while. Well, now we have within the growth team, an influencer marketing team, an affiliate, team. We have paid search team. We have an SEO team. And so I think it's really, for me, I do think there is a lot of it that has to do with stage, not across the board. I think there are some companies where you actually need 2 specialists from day one, and that's all you really need. But I think for me, the patterns that I've seen are earlier on, you benefit from generalists, later on, you benefit from specialists.
Yeah, well, so you started talking a little bit about kind of org chart there, and it's fascinating to hear. So it sounds like y'all bucket influencer marketing under growth, where at MarketerHire, for instance, we bucket influencer marketing more typically under like social media marketing, though it does often expand beyond that as well. How do you think about marketing org charts, building marketing org charts? Have you seen trends and successful ones? I mean, there's no real, right answer to how to build them, but they do provide clarity and structure. How does that work for your teams?
I align teams to outcomes. When we look at our influencer marketing, we do some influencer marketing work on the brand side. So for instance, we recently did a campaign with Olivia Wilde and Kenya Barris and Neil Patrick Harris and Ludacris. And, those are at the highest level influencers. The outcome for that was very much around brand awareness and visits. And so that fell into the brand category. When we do influencer marketing on the growth side, we're mostly sponsoring influencer videos on YouTube. And there's a real CAC threshold that we're looking at for acquisition there. And so that for me, the outcome, the expectation is much more tied to the goals that one associates with performance or growth marketing. And so that's why we follow, we put it under there. Whereas the outcome of, this celeb campaign, which was a different version of an influencer campaign, was much more around brand awareness and lift, et cetera. So we put it under brand. So I think for me, the way we organize it is around what is the work being measured against? And if it falls under sort of the parameters of growth, it goes under growth or brand.
Great. Well, so your growth team, it sounds like they do a lot of performance marketing work. What all is included? Like what all do you bucket under growth marketing?
Yeah. So I think, today we have affiliate, referral, influencer marketing, paid search. We do things like podcasts. And then we have a big test bucket. SEO is under growth. So really anything that's being driven towards, again, that top of funnel acquisition and being measured with regard to getting folks in the door. And then we have a big test bucket. So there are things that we're constantly testing that are not technically officially part of the team today, but we're testing into. And if we find that there's some success, then we continue to invest incrementally. And eventually, once it sort of proves itself out, then we'll stand up resources against it. And so that's sort of the way we think about growth marketing.
I like that. And it leads me perfectly into my next question. how you think about, when to bring on, an agency, a freelancer, a full-time hire. And it sounds like y'all kind of work with this growth bucket as a testing tool to like making those decisions.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I think about a lot is I think folks confuse time sensitivity with long-term need. We need this thing tomorrow. It's going to massively impact, our business. Let's hire someone to do it. And I think we have to ask ourselves, like, yes, this thing may be really impactful, but do you need it in 6 months and 6 years? And if the answer is, yes, I need it in 6 months, but definitely not in 6 years, then I think it's really worth going to, an agency or a freelancer model where you bring folks in. I think another place where I really like to turn to that sort of non-full-time support is when I need a really senior, and this is less so the case at Skillshare, but earlier in my career where I had a much more limited budget and I couldn't afford to hire somebody at a huge salary. I find sometimes we end up sort of bringing a very junior person in when we would actually be far better served by having a much more senior and experienced person come in to lay the groundwork and then hire a junior person to help keep sort of keep things moving forward. So that's another place where I look a lot to, freelancer supports. And then, I think those relationships are often very fluid. Our VP of creative and brand strategy started as a consultant. And it was in that classic realm of, we want to rethink the brand. We want to bring in somebody who's going to really help us do that in the most effective and impactful way. We want somebody who's done this before, who isn't making mistakes with us, like is allowing us to learn from the mistakes they've made on somebody else's dime. And he did this incredible job and we loved working with him. And now he's working for us full time. And then he relies on a team that, we flex up or down. That's the other thing is, we do these quarterly themes. So twice a year, we get a big team together to help build sort of what is our brand strategy for the next 12 to 18 months and what are the themes that we want to use for, the coming quarters. And so in those moments, we flex up. We bring a lot of consultants on, a lot of freelancers, get them in a room and help think that through. I think that provides a richness of ideas that if you're only working with your internal team, you miss out on. I think when you're living something day in and day out, so you sometimes lose objectivity in that 30,000 foot view. So it allows us to flex. And then once we have all those great ideas, then our more lean team will go and execute against them. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to leverage, freelance help.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I particularly love it because of the resources side of it, right? On this show, but I mean, also just in general, in my own career, talking to others, we hear a lot about like, okay, cool. I could build my ideal, like dream marketing team if I had the resources, but like resources are always the constraint. So maybe even more so in like the earlier days at particular companies. How do you manage maybe tight resources with figuring out like what comes first in terms of building a company, building a marketing team? Like what's the priority that you can put those resources to or should put those resources to first?
Incrementalism is actually very undervalued in this world. Like I think there's this idea that we should go in and do the big splash and then everyone will know who we are and we'll just have, you hear these stories about companies who are like, we're going to invest all our money in a Super Bowl ad. Or we're going to invest all our money in, sponsoring the football team in the UK. And, they blow their entire budget on this idea that we're going to make this big splash and then everyone's going to know who we are. And then we're kind of done. We don't ever have to worry about marketing again. Or my favorite is let's just create something viral. It's like, okay, well, if we all knew how to do that, if we knew how to do that for sure, we wouldn't, I think for me, what people often miss is that so much of good marketing is authentic connection. And that authentic connection comes not from the big splashy thing. It comes from the day in and day out. And so that's why I go back to what I said at the beginning, figure out what your brand is, figure out what and who you stand for, right? Like if you're trying to be everything to everyone, you are never going to succeed.
Right.
You're just not. Now, eventually you can build from there, right? But I often talk about Amazon, like, they started with books. It was now they had big visions for how they were going to go beyond that, but they didn't start as an online broad marketplace, right? They grew to that. So for me, it's about sort of doing the smaller connection driving initiatives. And so resources actually, I think lean resources can yield incredible innovation. I think some of the most interesting things that I've done in my career have been when I didn't have a lot of money and I couldn't do the easy thing, which is often, by the way, the lazy thing, right? And so, having to think differently, having to think outside the box, having to really sort of look at what's out there and figure out how to stand apart from folks. I think those are all really important or really valuable things that come from having lean resources. And so for me, I think that's the way that I think about it is figure out what you need to do, figure out what you have, and don't view it as a problem, view it as an opportunity. And then, like I said, I think, there is this perception that if you bring on freelance help, they won't know the brand as well, and you won't be able to, deliver the same level of work. I just don't think that's always true. And so I think really being able to leverage resources selectively to get you those bigger ideas is a big game changer for companies that don't have a lot of resources.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about incrementalism, if I'm going to put an ism to it there. How do you think about measuring that? Like if somebody's sitting here listening to this right now and it's like, okay, cool, I want to focus on that. Like what metrics are you regularly looking at? What even channels maybe are you regularly looking at to see the growth there?
Yeah, so I take this approach across the board. Our whole team does. So whenever we want to test something, we test it in a very small way first. And we have a real vision going into it around what success looks like. So, or there have been times when actually we don't know what success looks like. We look at benchmarking data and then we sort of say, okay, we're going to spend a really tiny amount and just see how we do. In terms of what we measure specifically, it really depends on the channel and the initiative. So, with something like when I first joined Skillshare, we had never done TV. We tested both broadcast and connected TV. And we did it in like very tiny amounts relative to what I think most people think of when they think of TV budgets. And what I was looking at there was views, unduplicated views. So I wanted to know, if I'm hitting the same 10 people over and over again, the same 10 people 10 times is not 100 views, it's 10. And so really understanding sort of what the unduplicated reach was, figuring out sort of how many people then clicked on our website. So with almost everything we do, we try to add some sort of digital measurement component that allows us to track from awareness through at least first click. That's very different than when we launch something, say on Facebook, where we're looking much more closely on, at CTR, and we're looking at the CAC, and we're looking at a much different set of metrics for success. But for me, it's all about you want to spend enough money that you feel like at the end of it, you have a good sense for whether that is a lever you can pull or not, that is useful to you. I think one of the worst things people do is they go in with such a tiny budget that then if it doesn't work, they're left wondering, well, did it not work because I didn't spend enough, or did it not work because it doesn't work? Yeah. So you want the budget to be healthy enough that you come out with a really good answer, but you want it to be small enough that if it's a failure, you feel like it was a really good expenditure regardless, because it was worth X dollars to learn that lesson. And so, so that's the way that I think about it in terms of specific measurements. Really depends on what we're testing.
Sure. What happens when some of those tests fail? Like what happens to those lessons? Like what happens, to all of it? Like what's the next step?
It's always building on. So I'll give you an example. We just did an email test that we all were sure was going to work. It just made such perfect sense to everybody. And it failed. It failed spectacularly. The answer then isn't, well, we're never doing that again. It's, let's figure out why it failed. And so that requires data. So we got under the hood, and it was a series of emails. So let's say there were 10 emails in the send. It ended up being the email on day one was so bad that it made the data for the other days look terrible. And so for us, it's about digging. One of the things we really believe in is curiosity. We want to inspire discovery through creativity at Skillshare. And we really believe in having that curious nature. We're an online learning platform, right? We take that same curiosity to everything we do internally. And so we are a team. I often say to my team, if we have not failed, we have not tried hard enough, right? We want to create an environment where people feel like it's okay to whiff on something, as long as we did it in a really thoughtful and organized way. And in a protective way. Like I said, we don't want to spend millions of dollars on something that we totally screwed up. We want to spend X thousands of dollars to figure it out and then build and build and build. And so yes, I think for us, when something fails, we think not, oh, this failed, move on. It's okay, well, why did it fail? And if it failed terribly, what is the opposite of that? Because is there an argument to be made that if that was so bad that the direct opposite would be so good? Should we try that next? So it's just about that again, to use the same word, incrementalism. It's like, what can we change just a little bit that will suddenly make it all kind of come together? I think about a story that I was at an event a couple of years ago, back when we did these things, and we went places. And there was this woman on stage who worked at Google, very senior at Google. And she said she remembers being in a meeting. I'm probably going to butcher the story a little bit, but this is what my memory of it was. Sergey Brin was like, parachutes, like bringing you your things. And the whole room was like, all right, sure. And the woman was saying she was so frustrated at herself because, Amazon then 2 years later came out with drone delivery. And she was like, the thing is, like, we all looked at the idea and we didn't come at it from a set place of curiosity where it's like, okay, parachutes aren't going to deliver things, but what's the idea there? And how do we sort of build on that in small ways to get to the thing that actually is doable? And so I think for me, that's the way that I think about, all sort of tests and mistakes. And it's like, what are the things we can learn? How do we move the ball forward just a little bit? I'm a big fan of failing forward. Like, let's fail and learn and move to the next thing.
You mentioned this a little bit, but you do have to be incredibly organized, I feel like, to do this really, really well. So can you talk me through maybe, a campaign that, Skillshare put together and talk through all of the different marketing departments and people that all had to kind of come together with these different ways of viewing it to ultimately get it to its final stage?
Yeah, I can give you two examples. So the first is just our brand launch. So we launched a new brand in January of last year. And that was, truly the most cross-functional thing I've ever been a part of. We had company-wide meetings a couple times a week where we were all reading out on, status updates and blockers and how we can work together on these things. And it really spanned. So it was the content team thinking about, as we move from a one-size-fits-all platform to a platform focused on creativity, how does our content shift? And how do we think about getting different folks onto the platform to teach? I think you sort of go from there to the product team. We had to, redo the entire look and feel of our website, and we wanted to test it. So, doing a test before we launched it to make sure that it wasn't going to, tank our numbers, and then, moving from there, and just across the board, the marketing team, putting the visuals together, the growth or performance marketing team, shifting all of our messaging out in market. And so across the board, it was this very tightly integrated experience, and it was incredibly successful. And I think part of it is that we landed on a brand that I think works really well in market. And we did that because we relied on data, both, qualitative and quantitative research to understand what people needed and wanted and were most benefiting from. So we weren't starting with what do we want it to be? We were starting with what do people want from us? And then how do we sort of help get there? Part of it is that it was just a resonant brand, but I actually think the bigger part of it was that it was just beautifully executed. Every team had DRI, so like a directly responsible person who was on point. We were really clear around like, here are the steps and here's who owns each step. And here's what happens, if something falls here, here's who you let know. Similar to, Amazon.
Let's talk about the details there though. Like were there weekly stand-ups with these teams? What tools were y'all using? Like what's that like operations back end of it for folks?
So in terms of tools, that's pretty team specific. So like the engineering team is using Jira tickets to keep track of things. Whereas, the content team was doing biweekly meetings, and, the marketing team, we were using some combination of that and like Google spreadsheets. And so each team, and I think that's important. I think when you are too prescriptive company-wide, it can sometimes result in people feeling like they're not well served by tools and therefore they don't use them. So, but at the highest level of the company, we have a weekly, what we call our BizOps meeting, where there's representatives from every team at the company. And so, that meeting became entirely about updating on how we were sort of progress, problems, and priorities. So like, what have you done since last we met? What are some problems you want to flag? Either because as a brain trust, we can all help solve that together, or because, hey, I want to give you a heads up. This is breaking over here for me, which means it's going to impact my timeline for you. And then what are your priorities for the next week? So we did have that. We make good use of Slack. So whenever we do any sort of initiative or test out in market, We create a Slack channel so people can be up, kept up to date in real time. And you can also get in touch with each other in really quick ways. And then when it came to the brand, we also had when we did this rollout, so we had the big meeting on Mondays, and then we were also meeting on Thursdays as a smaller team, the sort of execution team. So a much smaller group of people who were just there to flag, like, here's where we are, here's where we're missing, and just getting really explicit so that nobody was surprised and we were working really cross-functionally.
Yeah. How, if at all, has any of that changed with COVID and everybody working remotely?
I think there's like the typical challenges. It can be hard to connect when we're always on Zoom. I think, I will say the Skillshare team, and our people ops team has done an incredible job of creating opportunities to connect independent of work streams, which I think is really important, because I think that allows for folks to build a connection that then allows for these conversations to be more seamless, but also it allows you to push each other in different ways, which yields a better work product at the end of the day. So I think the team has done a really good job of trying to create some of the connectedness that we've lost by not being in the office together. You and I were talking before we went live, like, we have lunch. We used to have lunch 3 days a week, and Tracy actually taught a class on Skillshare, so she had lunch with us once, and before my time. But we used to all actually go and have lunch together, and so that was an opportunity to just catch up on our days and our weekends. And so I think we're trying to find ways to continue to do that. But otherwise, it hasn't changed a ton. I think we are continuing to have these meetings. They're just on Zoom. In some ways, they've gotten great because we've always had a portion of our workforce that is remote. For the folks that were remote when everybody else was in the office, that's really hard. Yeah. And now it sort of evens the playing field. We're all on Zoom. And we've done some things like, we've had some training, like you're supposed to wait 10 seconds when you ask a question on Zoom to get an answer before you move on to the next thing. It just takes longer for people to, pipe up. So it comes across as awkward silences. But I mean, I can't tell you, 8 times out of 10, when I get to I'm like 8, 9, and then somebody pipes up, and so creating those structures so that people genuinely can have their voices heard, I think is an important part of moving into this remote world.
Yeah. So you have been incredibly successful from the sounds of it, and also just from your career in general at building teams, specifically marketing teams. Talk to me about some of your hiring failures, like how and what they've taught you.
Oh my gosh, such a good question. I have not thought about this in a while. I will say, trust your gut. Like, I think where I have had hiring failures, it's almost always because I knew something was off, but somebody else didn't agree. And I just sort of went along. And I've almost always regretted that. I can't think of a time when I did that and then I was really surprised, at least for my team. I've had moments with other teams where I've come in to be like, hey, could you just interview to get your take on them? And I haven't been as strong on them, and then they've been amazing. So I'm not saying that I always have perfect judgment, but I think for my team, I've known enough about what I'm looking for that I don't think there's ever been a time when someone was like, you should hire this person, and I didn't think so, and then did and was surprised. So I think that one thing is to trust your gut. I also think it's really, there are a couple things that come to mind too. One is, I think oftentimes we're afraid to hire more senior people. I don't mean age. I mean, you end up hiring a junior person, expecting them to be able to deliver at the level of somebody who has 10 years more of experience. And you're setting those people up for failure. So I think getting really clear on the expectations and getting really clear on what you need that person to come to the table with versus what are some things where you're comfortable with them growing and learning on the job. Otherwise, I think you end up in a position where you've set neither party up for success. It's not that person's fault. And so, I think there have been that's in sort of another area where I've had some failures. And then I will say the other thing that I've done that is not that I've learned from that has helped me not have a lot of failures lately is I ask the same questions in every interview.
What are some of those?
So I always ask for a mistake. And I always ask for what people are most proud of, and I'm looking on the mistake. One of the biggest dings for me, and this was hard earned, is when people don't share a real mistake. When people either share something that people around them did that was bad, or they sort of, they pretend that something that's great is a mistake. You need humility, and you're not going to always get it right. And if you're not the kind of person who is looking at mistakes on a regular basis to figure out how you personally can get better, then you're not somebody who's going to do that in the professional context either. So that's a big one for me. I also look for pride because if you're not taking pride in the work that you're doing, then I have some questions around like your level of passion and your level of desire for excellence. And so I am curious about people's sort of what they're most proud of. So that's another question that I always ask. I do look for, I do the typical like background. If I'm interviewing somebody who's in a management role, I actually ask the question you just asked me, like, tell me about a time you hired somebody who wasn't great.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for someone who can either realize that they made a mistake quickly, or somebody who understands that management is a two-way relationship. And when I bring people on, I'm not bringing them on with the expectation that they're going to go off and do their job. I to some degree I am, and I want to give them the space to do that. I'm not a micromanager. But I also, I take far more stock in the fact that I take responsibility for helping move their career forward. And part of that for me is like, being honest when things aren't great and helping provide the right frameworks and structure and resources so that people can get better at their jobs. And, I think about the best boss I've ever had, who's actually become a really good friend. And it's like, we had the best time together and I love her. And there's a reason she's one of my best friends. But the most valuable stuff was when she was telling me things I didn't want to hear.
Right.
And that's a really good boss, is the boss who's like, you're great. This is not about me not liking you. Here's how you're totally wrong. And so I think I'm looking for folks who have that same attitude around, if somebody's failing at their job, that's not on them, at least not exclusively.
Right. So we have a question here from Hannah, which, by the way, everybody in the audience, this is my third time forgetting to say this at the beginning. Ask questions whenever, and we will answer them whenever. But I think the question overall is about, as like, how do you, when you're in early stages of a business, how do you hire, maybe those more junior people who are right for those positions? And then as the company grows, how can you effectively, help move them into more management roles? Essentially, how do you help shepherd a career at a fast growing company?
Yeah. A bit of a controversial answer. Like, I think you have to be careful starting with the junior folks. I think you're far better off hiring a more senior person who is willing and excited by the prospect of rolling their sleeves up. You're just going to get a lot further, a lot quicker than a more junior person. Now, when I started my career, this woman, Courtney, that I loved working for and with, she was very senior. She had a lot of experience. So they brought her, and she also wasn't afraid to roll her sleeves up. Like, I remember being in a conference room, putting bows on boxes to give out at events, And so, she started, and she was able to lay a really strong foundation in the groundwork. And then she hired a bunch of junior people. Like, when I joined, I had never done marketing before, really. Like, I had a stint at a place for 6 months, but it was more of a sales role. And I think by virtue of having a senior person that I could look up to and whose example I could model myself after, that, it required a lot less of the senior leadership team in terms of getting me up to speed. And I think she took her job very seriously. She was very focused on how do I remember her saying fairly early on, I want you to take my job someday. And I did. And I know she wanted me to, and so she left. It wasn't like I pushed her out or anything. She chose to leave. But I think, so I think, to answer your question, I think, Hannah, you said, ask the question. I think I would start with a senior hire. Now, that being said, if you had a junior person on the team and that's all you had, I think hiring for grit more than experience at that point is really important. Like, if you're hiring somebody 1 or 2 years out of school, what's on their resume just doesn't matter in terms of career experience. Like, I came to Axiom, my first role, from a law firm, but I had a lot of grit. Like, I don't come from a lot. I had to figure things out myself, and I was a really hard worker. I really was hungry for it. I was passionate about the mission. So I think indexing on people who care deeply about what you're doing as an organization, who are really going to be hardworking and want to figure it out, who are not daunted by difficult things, like, hire for that more than if they have a marketing degree or they had a great marketing internship. Like, that's not actually going to move the needle for you. So you're much better off hiring for that. And then those people, often they will raise their hand. Like, they will come to you with opportunities for growth. They will come to you with ideas for how to push the team forward. So it requires a lot less handholding in terms of helping them. And so it becomes more around giving them the resources and getting out of their way.
Yeah, I like that. How do you think about not necessarily in the situation that Hannah kind of detailed, but more so in just like taking folks who are ready for management positions? How, like, one, how can you identify that in somebody? And two, if it's their first management position, how do you help train them on how to kind of transition from that executional role to that more managing a team role?
So in terms of how to identify it, I once heard the publisher of, I think it was like Time Out New York, say she never got a job she hadn't already been doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more nuance to it, right? Like we all hear the stats about how men will take jobs, white men in particular will take jobs that they have no experience for, and women won't take them until they know they're good at them. So there's nuance there, like raise your hand, take the job. That's not what I'm trying to say here, but I do think you'll identify in people like they've already stepped up, they've already demonstrated. And so it's less about getting them to that place. It's about rewarding and doing it like at the right moment. Like you don't want to wait so long that they've been doing a job and not getting paid for it. But you'll start to see like they've started to step in and take on more responsibility because they want to, and then being able to reward that with additional official responsibility and the pay that goes with it. So I think sort of people who have that self-starter is where I look for in terms of management. In terms of training folks, I think for me, some of it is just being explicit. Like I remember when I started managing people, you know, there is this feeling of like, well, if I'm not doing it, am I going to get credit for doing good work? Like there is this sort of fear that comes. And I had this myself when I was more junior, and I've seen it almost to a T with everybody who's ever worked with me where they haven't had anybody underneath them. And then we start to bring people, this feeling of like, but what if they end up taking over my job? And it's like, oh my gosh, no, you know, it gives you more room to do more interesting things and step into new things and steepen your learning curve. And so but I remember the first manager who was ever explicit with me and said, there is a difference between managing and leading. And so one is identifying where on the spectrum do you want this person to be? You know, a lot of what I do today as a CMO, I don't do a lot of individual contributor work. Now, I hope my team knows I'm always happy to, and I'm happy to do the lowest of the wrong work if we need hands on deck. But a lot of my time is just actually managing people and creating the space and opportunities for them to succeed and feel fulfilled. But somebody needed to actually say that to me explicitly before I recognized that that's what my role was supposed to be. And so I'm very grateful for the manager who sat me down. She presented this like business school chart where it was like management, leadership, doing, you know, and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So I think some of it is being explicit. I think some of it is also just, I think we have this, there's this awful like movie created version of like, when you're a leader, you tell people what to do. And that's just not the truth, right? Leadership is earned. And it's not about telling people what to do. It's about inspiring people to follow. And it's a two-way street, as I said earlier. So it's as much around what can I learn? I mean, my team is far better at the things they do than I ever will be. Like I think about, you know, Jeremy who runs creative and Kyle who runs growth and Matali who runs, like they are just, you know, they are better at each of those things than I will ever be. And giving them the space to do that is a big part of my job, but then also being there to support them and to help them and to push them. And you know, it's a big job. And I think sometimes people think of management as like, oh, cool, this is when I go on easy street and people are just doing the dirty work for me. And that's just so far from the truth. So I think to be a good manager, I mean, you know, you probably have more weight on your shoulders than in any other part of your career because you care deeply about making sure that you're creating a team that is high functioning and collaborative and, you know, driving results, but in the right ways.
Right. Enjoys being there.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
Okay. So we have time maybe for one more question, and we have one in here from Imogen, but Imogen, if you are still here and can maybe provide a little bit of clarity, because there are a million different types of collaborative partnerships. So if the question is, what do you look for in a collaborative partnership? That could be with another brand, that could be with like other like leaders in the organization, but let's go with that latter one. Like how do you build, you know, good relationships with, you know, the head of sales, with the CEO? Like how does it, you know, that internal comms and those leadership relationships work to help a marketing team overall?
Yeah. I know I probably sound like a broken record. It comes back to building that brand at the outset. Yeah. Because if you do a really good job of building that brand, everybody is on board. Yeah. Everybody is bought into the vision and understands that brand is not the purview of marketing. It is the purview of every company. And marketing is simply how do we get, you know, how do we get more people to fall in love with our company the way we have? And so I think that's one thing that you can do is just making sure that everybody's on the same page and bought in, and really actually taking the time to make sure people are bought in, right? Like I remember when I was at Blockchain, we had one of the greatest things about that company was that we had people across the full spectrum. Like we had folks who were anti-government, never used their name in any public setting because they were, you know, like afraid of NASA, of the NSA taking their information. And then you had folks like me who like, you know, I love government. Like, we just as full spectrum. My job when I came in was like total listening tour, and getting people aligned does not mean that everybody buys in 100%, but it's that they understand the vision and they appreciate it and they agree with it, even if it's not exactly what they would have done.
Right.
So I think that's the first thing that you need to do is just get that buy-in. I think it's prove yourself, right? Like I often say, if somebody is frustrated with our team, we've not done a good enough job of demonstrating the impact we can have. And that's what I often find is like, or if people, because the other thing that happens with marketing is people kind of go around you. Like, I'm just going to go do this separately so I can get it out more quickly, or so I don't feel like they're telling me I have to do this differently. If you've got that culture, you've not done a great job. And that's what we find at Skillshare. It's like, people were off doing their own thing. We created these themes that everybody could align around on a quarterly basis, but also we started just supporting teams. And the minute you support them and they see how much better the work can be when you take the time to sort of really be thoughtful from a brand forward perspective, the inbounds will come. People will want you to work on their things. So I think it's that 1-2 punch of get everybody in at the top and then just show results and make sure you're communicating those results. Because I think often what happens is it works, it's great, and you don't tell anybody. So they have no idea that you've done this great thing.
Right.
So making sure that they know, how the impact you can have on their specific teams.
Yeah. How are you and your team celebrating wins right now internally? Is it through Slack for the most part, emails? How does that work?
We do Slack. So we have a shout outs channel where we shout each other out. We do have a weekly meeting, a town hall that's company wide. And we do wins there. So folks will present sort of any big wins for the week. And then our marketing team has a weekly meeting as well. And so we'll celebrate sort of any wins in that setting as well.
Awesome. Well, Liana, thank you so much for joining us and honestly just sharing all of your insight. I mean, I have been a leader / manager for about 3 years now, and I feel like I just went to a master class, so that's amazing. So thank you so much again for being here. Thank you to the Webbies also for sponsoring. For everybody here listening, this is recorded, so we will get it up and live. You can always go back and rewatch later. But yeah, thanks so much again.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everyone. Bye.